Dust coated his boots as he stood before the fresh grave. He'd ridden 500 miles to bury the woman who raised him, only to find the earth already settled and a stranger's name carved beneath hers. This wasn't just a funeral. It was a cover-up. And he was next. The biting wind of the Montana Territory carried the scent of pine needles and impending snow as Wyatt Caldwell rode his exhausted roan gelding into the mining town of Silver Bow. It was late autumn of 1883, and the town had swelled like a bruised thumb since he had last seen it 5 years prior. Tents and wooden shanties had been replaced by imposing brick facades, most of them bearing the same freshly painted name, Thaddeus Boone. Wyatt hadn't returned for a homecoming. In his saddlebag rested a crumpled telegram that had chased him across 3 states, Ariana passed. Come quick. There was no warmth in his arrival, only a hollow, gnawing ache. He bypassed the saloons and the bustling mercantile, steering his horse straight toward Boot Hill on the edge of town. The cemetery was a bleak patch of frosted earth, littered with crooked wooden crosses and weathered headstones that told the stories of men who had died from silver fever, whiskey, or lead. He found her plot near a solitary weeping willow. The dirt was still mounded, dusted with a thin layer of frost. A simple wooden cross bore her name, Ariana Caldwell, beloved mother. Wyatt dropped to one knee, taking off his Stetson. The silence of the graveyard was heavy, broken only by the cawing of a raven. He reached out to trace the carved letters, his gloved fingers trembling. Then his eyes dropped to the bottom of the cross. Freshly gouged into the wood, stark and inexplicable, was a second line, and her faithful ward, Jonathan. Wyatt's breath caught in his throat. Jonathan? Ariana lived alone. She had no ward. Wyatt was her only son, a prodigal drifter who had left after a bitter argument over the family ranch. Who in God's name was buried in the same pine box as his mother? She didn't want you to see it this way. A soft voice spoke from behind him. Wyatt's hand instinctively drifted toward the Colt 45 at his hip before he recognized the silhouette standing against the gray sky. It was Clara Montgomery. 5 years ago, she had been a girl with wildflowers in her hair and the laugh that could outshine the Montana sun. The woman standing before him now was hardened. Her cheekbones were sharp, her eyes shadowed, and she wore a heavy canvas coat that looked 2 sizes too big. In her gloved hands, she clutched a bundle of dried sage. Clara, Wyatt breathed, standing up. What happened? The telegram said consumption. Doc Olcott signed it. Clara stepped forward, laying the sage gently at the base of the cross. When she looked up at him, her eyes were cold, harboring a fury Wyatt had never seen in her before. Josiah Olcott is a coward and a liar on Thaddeus Boone's payroll, Clara said, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. She looked over her shoulder toward the town below, making sure they were alone. Your mother didn't die of consumption, Wyatt, and she didn't die 3 days ago. She's been in the ground for over 2 weeks. The words hit Wyatt like a physical blow. 2 weeks. I got the telegram. The telegram was held. Clara interrupted, stepping closer. Delayed at the telegraph office by Boone's men. They needed time. Time to file a quiet title claim on the Caldwell Ranch, declaring the property abandoned by her only heir. Wyatt's jaw tightened. And who is Jonathan? Clara's gaze broke, dropping to the frost-covered dirt. A tear slipped free, leaving a clean trail through the dust on her cheek. Jonathan was my younger brother. He went missing 3 weeks ago. Ariana, she found out something. Something about Thaddeus Boone, the Northern Pacific Railway, and what they're really doing in Whispering Canyon. She took Jonathan in to hide him. 2 days later, her cabin caught fire. They said she inhaled too much smoke. They said Jonathan was trapped inside. Wyatt felt the blood roaring in his ears. The image of his strong, defiant mother, the woman who had broken wild mustangs and survived brutal winters suffocating in a house fire set by greedy men, made his stomach churn. I left this town because I couldn't stand the quiet, Wyatt muttered, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his hat. I should have been here. You being here wouldn't have stopped Boone. He operates like a king, Clara said bitterly. He buys the law. Deputy Marshal Nathaniel Reed was supposed to come up from Helena to investigate the fire, but he never arrived. Word is he was ambushed in the Bitterroot Mountains. Real life up here ain't like the dime novels, Wyatt. The bad men are winning. Wyatt settled his Stetson back onto his head, his eyes locking onto the sprawling brick mercantile down in the valley. They haven't won yet. I need to see the house, Clara. I need to see what's left. The ride to Whispering Canyon took less than an hour, but every mile felt like a march toward a battlefield. The Caldwell Ranch sat in a sprawling valley, flanked by jagged limestone cliffs and fed by a pristine, winding river. It was prime grazing land, but as they crested the final ridge, Wyatt saw the devastation. The corral fences were smashed, the livestock long gone. The main cabin, built by Wyatt's father 30 years prior, was a charred skeleton. Only the stone chimney and the eastern wall remained standing, blackened and pathetic against the sweeping Montana sky. Dismounting, Wyatt walked through the ash, his boots crunching loudly in the eerie silence. Clara followed close behind, her Winchester rifle resting easily in the crook of her arm. They tossed the place before they burned it, Clara noted, kicking aside a half-melted iron skillet. Whatever Ariana had on Boone, they were looking for it. I just pray to God it burned up, or else they're going to come looking for us next. Wyatt didn't answer. He was staring at the massive stone fireplace. His father had built it using river rock, painstakingly stacking them to withstand the brutal winters. But Wyatt remembered something else, a secret his mother had shared with him when he was just 10 years old, after a drifter had tried to rob them. Seamen will always look in drawers and under beds, Wyatt, Ariana had told him, prying a flat, heavy stone away from the side of the chimney flue. But they rarely want to reach their hands into the soot. Wyatt dropped to his knees in the ash. He reached into the black maw of the fireplace, feeling along the right-hand side. The stones were scorched and slick with soot. He felt the mortar, pressing hard until one of the rocks shifted with a grinding sound. "Wyatt," Clara asked, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" Hoping she remembered, he grunted, wedging his fingers behind the loose stone and pulling it free. He reached deep into the cavity behind the flue, his fingers brushed against cold metal. He pulled it out, a heavy iron lockbox completely untouched by the flames. Clara gasped. Wyatt drew his hunting knife and wedged the thick blade under the hasp, twisting with all his might. The rusted lock snapped with a sharp crack. Inside, wrapped tightly in oilcloth, was a stack of papers. Wyatt unfolded them carefully. On top was a map, not a local surveyor's map, but an official topographical blueprint bearing the seal of the Northern Pacific Railway. A thick red line was drawn straight through Whispering Canyon, right over the Caldwell property. "It's a railroad spur," Clara whispered, leaning over his shoulder. "Boone isn't just buying cattle land. The railroad is secretly planning to bypass the southern route and cut through the canyon. Whoever owns this land when the Northern Pacific arrives stands to make hundreds of thousands of dollars in right-of-way fees." Beneath the map was a leather-bound journal. Wyatt opened it to the final entry, dated just 3 days before his mother's supposed death. He recognized Ariana's elegant, sweeping handwriting immediately. October 14th, 1883. They took Arthur Montgomery's boy today. Thaddeus Boone found out little Jonathan overheard his men talking about the Northern Pacific surveyor they murdered last month. I have the boy hidden in the root cellar, but Boone's enforcer, Jebediah Rollins, was sniffing around the property line at dusk. I am sending a letter to the territorial governor, but I fear it will not make it past the postmaster. If anything happens to me, the deed to this land is legally transferred not to my stubborn son, Wyatt, who is too far away to fight this war, but to Clara Montgomery. She is the rightful owner of the silver vein they found on the western ridge, the very vein Boone killed her father to cover up. May God forgive me for dragging her into this. Wyatt stopped reading, the air leaving his lungs. He looked up at Clara. She was pale, her eyes wide with shock. "My father," Clara's voice broke. "Boone said my father died in a hunting accident. He said a bear took him down near the tree line." "Boone killed him," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Your father found silver on the western ridge of our property." Boone silenced him. Then came after my mother when she found out about the railroad and the silver. She left the land to you, Clara, to ensure Boone couldn't just steal it from an absent son. Before Clara could process the revelation, a sound echoed off the canyon walls. It was the sharp, rhythmic thud of galloping horses. Wyatt shoved the papers into his coat pocket and spun around, dropping into a crouch behind the charred remnants of the front wall. Clara dropped beside him, racking the lever of her Winchester. Riding hard down the canyon path was a posse of 6 men. At the front rode a massive, bearded man wearing a bowler hat and a duster coat. He rode a vicious-looking black stallion, and in his right hand he carried a double-barreled shotgun resting on his thigh. "Jebediah Rollins," Clara hissed, her knuckles turning white on the rifle. "Boone's dog. They must have seen us leave town. They think they're coming to clean up a loose end," Wyatt said, drawing his Colt .45 and checking the cylinder. The grief that had weighed him down at Boot Hill was suddenly gone, replaced by a cold, burning clarity. He copped the hammer, the metallic click sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet ruins of his childhood home. "Wyatt," Clara said, her voice trembling slightly, not from fear but from adrenaline. "There's 6 of them." Wyatt looked at the woman he had once loved, the woman who had suffered in his absence, and the smoldering ashes of the mother who had died protecting her. "Then it's a good thing I brought enough bullets," Wyatt replied. Rollins yanked back on his reins, bringing his posse to a halt 30 yards from the ruined cabin. Dust swirled around the horses' hooves. "Well now," Rollins bellowed, his voice echoing like thunder. "Looks like the prodigal son decided to come home after all. Mighty sad about your ma, Caldwell, but you're trespassing on Thaddeus Boone's property." Wyatt slowly stood up from behind the charred wall, his gun leveled at Rollins' chest. "The only thing Thaddeus Boone owns," Wyatt called back, his voice slicing through the biting wind, "is the 6 feet of dirt I'm about to bury you in." The stillness of Whispering Canyon shattered in an instant. Wyatt didn't wait for Jebediah Rollins to finish his boast. He dropped his shoulder, leveling the heavy barrel of the Colt .45. The gun bucked in his hand, a roar of smoke and fire tearing through the frigid afternoon air. The man riding to Rollins' left let out a sharp grunt as the .45 caliber slug caught him square in the collarbone, throwing him violently from his saddle. "Fire! Gunner down!" Rollins bellowed, spurring his black stallion toward the tree line as his remaining 4 men scrambled for cover behind a cluster of limestone boulders. A hail of lead rained down on the charred remains of the Caldwell cabin. Bullets chewed into the stone chimney and sent plumes of gray ash into the air, clouding Wyatt's vision. Beside him, Clara Montgomery didn't flinch. She propped the barrel of her Winchester against a blackened beam, took a breath to steady her racing heart, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, and one of Boone's hired guns spun out from behind a rock, clutching his thigh with a howl of agony. "They have the high ground," Wyatt shouted over the deafening volley of gunfire. He ejected the spent casings from his revolver, sliding fresh brass into the cylinder with practiced mechanical precision. "If they pin us behind this chimney, they'll flank us through the creek bed." "I can hold them here," Clara yelled back, racking another round into the chamber. Her face was smudged with soot, her eyes blazing with a feral intensity. She wasn't just fighting for her life. She was fighting for the memory of her father and the woman who had burned to keep her safe. "Go, Wyatt. Take the gully." Wyatt gave her a curt nod. He waited for a lull in the shooting, then pushed off the ground, sprinting low and fast across the open yard. A bullet whipped past his ear, close enough to leave a phantom sting, before he dove headfirst into the dried, waist-deep trench of the creek bed. He crawled on his belly over the frozen rocks, ignoring the sharp edges slicing into his coat. He moved with the stealth of a mountain lion, a skill he had learned tracking elk with his father in the Bitterroot Mountains. He navigated the winding ditch until he was parallel with the boulders where Rollins and his men were entrenched. Peering over the frost-hardened earth, Wyatt saw 3 men. 2 were laying down, suppressing fire on the cabin, while Rollins was frantically reloading his double-barreled shotgun, his thick fingers fumbling with the heavy brass shells. Wyatt stood up, his boots planted firmly in the gravel. "Rollins," he roared. The giant man whipped around, his eyes widening in shock. Wyatt fired twice. The first bullet shattered the stock of Rollins' shotgun, blowing it out of his hands. The second caught the enforcer in the right shoulder, sending him crashing backward into the dirt. The two remaining thugs spun around, raising their six-shooters, but Clara was already moving. Seeing Wyatt draw their fire, she had advanced from the cabin. Her Winchester barked twice in rapid succession. The men dropped their weapons, throwing their hands into the air as the dirt kicked up inches from their boots. "Don't shoot! We yield!" One of them screamed, falling to his knees. Wyatt climbed out of the creek bed, keeping his Colt aimed steadily at Rollins, who was groaning in the dirt, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Clara approached from the other side, her rifle trained on the two surrendered men. She kicked their weapons into the brush. Wyatt stood over Rollins, his shadow falling across the wounded man's face. He cocked the hammer of his revolver, the metallic click echoing off the canyon walls. "You killed my mother," Wyatt said, his voice terrifyingly calm. It lacked the heat of anger, it was just cold, hard fact. "You burned her alive for a piece of paper and a strip of railroad." Rollins spat a glob of blood into the frost. He let out a wet, rattling laugh. "Boone pays me to clear obstacles, Caldwell. Your ma was a stubborn old mule. But she was a smart one. We couldn't find the deed or the map." "And the boy?" Clara demanded, stepping forward, her voice trembling as the adrenaline began to fade. "What did you do to Jonathan?" Rollins looked at Clara, a cruel smile twisting his lips. "The fire burned hot, little lady, left nothing but ash and bone." Wyatt pressed the barrel of his Colt directly against Rollins' kneecap. "A man facing his maker shouldn't lie, Jebediah. Tell me the truth, or you're going to spend your last few minutes in agonizing pain." Rollins swallowed hard, the cruel smile vanishing. He looked at the uncompromising steel in Wyatt's eyes and knew the cowboy wasn't bluffing. All right, Rollins wheezed. "The boy ain't dead. Boone wouldn't let us kill a kid outright. Too much heat if a body was found. He sent him away." Clara dropped to her knees, grabbing Rollins by his heavy canvas collar. "Sent him where? Where is my brother?" "He's on the midnight freighter," Rollins gasped, grimacing as pain flared in his shoulder. "Boone sold him to the labor contractors working the Northern Pacific expansion down in the Bozeman Pass. They put the orphans in the deep shafts to lay dynamite. He's leaving tonight on the 11:45 train out of Silver Bow." Wyatt checked his pocket watch. It was nearing 6 in the evening. The sun was already dipping below the jagged peaks of the mountains, casting long, purple shadows across the ruined homestead. "Tie them up," Wyatt told Clara, gesturing to the surviving men. "Leave them for the wolves or the winter, I don't care. We have a train to catch." As Clara bound the men with their own rioters, Wyatt knelt beside the soot-stained ruins of his childhood home. He picked up a piece of a shattered porcelain teacup, one that had belonged to Ariana. He slipped it into his pocket, right beside the ironclad proof of Thaddeus Boone's treachery. The grief was still there, a heavy stone in his chest, but it had ignited into a purposeful burning drive. Clara walked up beside him, gently placing a hand on his arm. "Wyatt, I'm so sorry. About the things I said at the cemetery. About everything." Wyatt looked down at her. In the fading light he saw the fierce, beautiful woman she had become. The years of distance between them evaporated in the smoke of the canyon. "You survived, Clara. You kept her memory alive. Now, we're going to get your brother back, and we're going to burn Thaddeus Boone's empire to the ground." The ride back to Silver Bow was conducted in breathless silence under the pale light of a waxing moon. The temperature had plummeted, turning the mud of the trails into hard, treacherous ridges. Wyatt and Clara rode hard, abandoning stealth for speed. They reached the outskirts of town by 11 o'clock. Silver Bow was alive with the chaotic energy of a boom town at night. Piano music spilled from the saloons, mixing with the harsh laughter of miners and the rhythmic clinking of glasses. But down by the rail depot the atmosphere was strictly industrial. Thick plumes of black smoke billowed from the stacks of a massive locomotive, idling like an iron beast waiting to be unleashed. Leaving their horses tied behind the livery, Wyatt and Clara moved through the alleys. "The freight cars are loaded in the yard behind Boone's Mercantile," Clara whispered, pointing toward a heavily guarded brick warehouse adjacent to the tracks. 3 men armed with repeating rifles patrolled the perimeter. Through the slatted wood of the cattle cars, Wyatt could hear the faint, muffled sounds of shifting bodies. "We can't take them all in a firefight, not without risking the people inside those cars," Wyatt muttered, scanning the layout. His eyes fell on the Mercantile's second-story window. Warm yellow light spilled from the glass. Thaddeus Boone's private office. "You get Jonathan," Wyatt said, pulling the oilcloth bundle from his coat and handing it to Clara. "Take the map and the journal. Once you have him, go straight to the telegraph office. The operator, old man Higgins, owed my father his life. They'll send a wire to the territorial governor in Helena." "What are you going to do?" Clara asked, her fingers tightly gripping the documents. "I'm going to make a withdrawal," Wyatt said grimly. While Clara slipped off into the shadows toward the rail cars, Wyatt moved toward the side entrance of the Mercantile. He picked the simple lock on the heavy oak door and slipped inside. The ground floor was a labyrinth of dry goods, flour sacks, and mining equipment. He moved silently up the wooden staircase, the sound of his spurs muffled by the heavy carpet runner. Voices leaked from beneath the crack of Boone's office door. "And the right-of-way will be fully secured by next week, Mr. Pennington," a smooth, cultured voice was saying. "The Caldwell property is legally vacant, soon to be seized for back taxes and transferred to my holding company. The Northern Pacific doesn't care about your local politics, Boone." A second, nasally voice replied. "We care about the deadline. If the track through Whispering Canyon isn't laid before the first heavy snow, we lose millions." Wyatt didn't bother knocking. He kicked the door with the flat of his boot, shattering the latch and sending the heavy oak crashing against the wall. Thaddeus Boone, a well-dressed man with slicked-back hair and a silk cravat, jumped from behind his mahogany desk. Sitting across from him was Alistair Pennington, a nervous-looking railroad executive in a tailored suit. A third man, wearing a deputy's badge, reached for his holster. Wyatt's Colt was out and leveled before the deputy's gun cleared leather. "I wouldn't," Wyatt warned softly. The deputy froze, raising his hand slowly. "Caldwell," Boone sneered, recovering his composure. He smoothed the front of his waistcoat. "I heard you were back in town. You have a lot of nerve breaking into my establishment. And you have a lot of nerve burying an empty pine box with my mother's name on it," Wyatt countered, stepping fully into the room and kicking the door shut behind him. "I don't know what you're talking about," Boone lied smoothly, glancing nervously at Pennington. "Your mother died tragically in a fire. It was an accident. The only accident was your men failing to find the lockbox in the chimney," Wyatt said. He didn't have the papers, but Boone didn't know that. "I know about the silver vein on the Montgomery land. I know about the secret railroad spur. And I know you murdered Arthur Montgomery and Ariana Caldwell to get it." Pennington stood up, his face pale. "Boone, what is he talking about?" "You assured me the land titles were clean. They are clean," Boone snapped. He glared at Wyatt. "You have no proof, boy. Just the raving accusations of a grief-stricken drifter." Suddenly, the shrill blast of a train whistle pierced the night, followed instantly by the sound of shouting and gunfire from the rail yard below. Boone's eyes darted toward the window. "That would be Clara Montgomery," Wyatt said, a grim smile touching his lips, "retrieving her brother from the slave train you were putting him on. She's also on her way to the telegraph office with a map drawn by the Northern Pacific, and my mother's journal detailing every murder you ordered. By tomorrow morning, every federal marshal in Helena will be riding for Silverbow." Boone's facade finally cracked. Panic flared in his eyes. In a desperate, panicked motion, he lunged for the top drawer of his desk, pulling out a silver-plated derringer. He never got the chance to aim it. Wyatt fired a single shot. The bullet tore through Boone's right shoulder, spinning the corrupt Baron around and sending him crashing through the glass of his own window. He landed heavily on the wooden awning below, screaming in agony. The deputy in the room immediately dropped his gun belt to the floor, terrified. Pennington threw his hands in the air, babbling about having no knowledge of Boone's violent methods. Wyatt walked over to the shattered window, looking down at the street. A crowd was already gathering, drawn by the gunfire. Down the street, illuminated by the glow of a street lamp, he saw Clara. She was holding a ragged, soot-stained young boy in her arms, crying tears of relief. Little Jonathan was safe. The reign of Thaddeus Boone was over. 2 days later, the territorial governor's men arrived. Boone and his surviving thugs were placed in irons and loaded onto the very train they had intended to use for their captives, bound for the federal penitentiary. The Northern Pacific, eager to distance itself from the scandal, agreed to heavily compensate Clara Montgomery for the rights to build through Whispering Canyon, leaving the rich silver vein entirely in her name. Wyatt stood at Boot Hill once more, under the weeping willow. The false plaque had been removed. Clara stood beside him, her hand slipped warmly into his. "You going to ride out again?" she asked softly, looking out over the town that was finally breathing free. Wyatt looked down at the fresh earth, then out toward the distant, jagged peaks of Whispering Canyon. The fire had taken the house, but the foundation, the stones his father had laid, the land his mother had died for remained. "No," Wyatt said, his grip tightening on Clara's hand. "I think it's time to start rebuilding." Did the courage of Wyatt and Clara leave you breathless? The Wild West was built on untold stories of sacrifice, betrayal, and unyielding justice. If you loved this thrilling tale of revenge and redemption, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible frontier dramas. Don't let history fade away. Ride with us into the next unforgettable adventure.